I think the title of this talk was supposed to be about the ideology of Silicon Valley, and there's so much that can be said about that. What I want to talk about today is like this very particular thrust within the industry, political, this imagination of tech as being removed from politics, and that we can just, if we just give Silicon Valley more power, then we'll fix everything. So first, I'll give a little bit of background on myself and how I came to write this book. I did not plan on writing this book. I did not imagine myself as a writer. I studied computer science. I thought I would be a software engineer forever. The way I got to this point is I had started my own startup, and I was the CTO, and I had several other co-founders. And we, at the time, had all very much believed in the vision of Silicon Valley as this place that, one, has all this unimaginable wealth, and that, we could become very wealthy, we could become very successful, but also a place that was about the greater good. That if we put our energy into this startup and making the startup as successful as possible, then we would be helping the rest of the world somehow. We didn't really have a good understanding of why. We just took it on faith that the tech industry was about making the world a better place. And when I say that now, it feels almost silly because it's very hard to believe that these days. But back then, for me in the early 2010s, that was just the air around me. Me and all my friends, we all really believed that the industry was about the greater good. So what happened for me is that after about 2.5 years into my startup, I started to become disillusioned because the startup that I built, we started with this very generic idea of data science applied to like consumer data. And we didn't really know what we would do with that. We just thought, okay, well, we will explore the market, we will build things that people want, and then we'll end up with this really useful, amazing business. And it turned out the only actual use cases were in things like advertising. And so we ended up, our biggest customer was a brand, a consumer brand that gave us all their emails, and we would try to tell them who their customers were. So we would say, this person likes yoga, this person likes Justin Bieber, here are all the people under the age of 30, here are all the women, here are all the people in New York versus California. So basically customer segmentation, that was what we ended up doing. And so I'd started out this process believing that because I had these technical skills that I could build something that was not only technically interesting, but also socially useful in some way. And then we ended up essentially being part of the advertising technology ecosystem. And once that realization caught up to me, I started to think more critically about the industry as a whole, because I was looking around the industry. I was looking around the industry, I was seeing what other companies were getting funded, and I was following the news about the rest of the world, the fact that there were so many people who were poor. There in the US, there's a huge healthcare crisis. Most Americans couldn't afford $400 in an emergency. I was paying attention to things like that. And it started to hit me that the industry that I believed in was not actually part of the solution, and in some ways could even be part of the problem. And that was a difficult thing to realize because I just didn't know what the alternative was. I had completely bought into the idea that capitalism was all about innovation and that Silicon Valley was the pinnacle of that. So because of that experience, because of essentially falling out of love with the tech industry, I decided to do a master's degree at the London School of Economics, and that was where I was exposed to these ideas of criticizing the tech industry in terms of its impact on inequality, in terms of its lack of democracy, and things like that. So then I started researching more about the critiques of the industry and trying to figure out how we could fashion a new tech industry, or just a new way of developing tech that was more about democracy and actually making the world a better place, and not just making a few people tremendously wealthy. So yeah, with the book, the book is actually more of a memoir than it is, criticism or analysis. A lot of it is just explaining my story and trying to get people to see the world the way that I saw it then and how I see it now. But so for this, I want to talk about the ideology of the industry, because I think that's something that it's very pervasive, but it's also very hard to talk about, because when you're in the tech industry bubble, you see the world a certain way. And when you're outside of it, and I imagine here we have, academics, activists who are already more critical of the industry, that's a completely different worldview. And when I was in that bubble, I did not understand the criticism. It just seemed to me like it came from a place of spite or jealousy. I thought that the people who were critiquing the industry, or the billionaires of the industry, I thought they were just jealous or otherwise just wrong. It didn't occur to me that they had a valid perspective. And I see the perspective that I used to have as something unfortunately very common today. And so what I'm trying to do with my work is to kind of bridge that gap, to help make the critiques offered by activists and academics and researchers more palatable, more impactful for those inside the industry who have the possibility of changing things from within. And so what I wanted to talk about today was, it's kind of funny, I didn't actually plan this before, but there's a venture capitalist named Marc Andreessen, who I imagine some are familiar with. He wrote a blog post, I think it just came out 2 days ago. And the blog post is titled, "It's Time to Build." And, insofar as it's possible to make sweeping generalizations about the industry, the tech industry, and the culture in it, I think this blog post distills it very well. It's like the essence of Silicon Valley hubris. And so, yeah, I just want to talk about it a little bit. It's called "It's Time to Build" by Marc Andreessen, who is co-founder of the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. And he is the man who coined the term "software is eating the world." And so he's been a very pivotal figure in the development of the tech industry. And he was also one of the creators of Netscape, which is a browser that is now very fundamental to the way modern browsers are built. And so he's a polarizing figure. He's been the object of controversy in the past. I remember he said that colonialism was something great that happened to India. I think the worst thing that happened to India was when they got rid of colonialism. It was a very strange, provocative thing. But so he's no stranger to controversy. But this latest blog post is him saying that the coronavirus pandemic has exposed the extent to which Western institutions are incapable of addressing it. And he makes some good points. I think I agree with the general thrust of it. But what I find really, really fascinating and really worthy of discussion is the way he thinks that we can issue politics. That what we need to do is just build. That we don't need to get lost in political infighting. That if Silicon Valley and other people just stopped talking about things and just started building, then we can fix it. And I think that stems from this deeply ingrained idea that's common to Silicon Valley, but also just, it's not uniquely a tech thing. But there's this idea that there's politics over here, and then there's the economy over here, and that we can build things without considering the political implications. When I think, definitely from my perspective, and hopefully from some of you here, I think it's another understanding of politics is that politics is in everything. Politics is about how to distribute scarce resources, how to reconcile competing perspectives. And so there's no way of going above politics. But I do think that, this is one of the central conceits of the tech industry, that there is a way of just building, of just moving forward, that, we don't have to move left or right, we can go forward, we can just build things and let the politicians figure it out later. And I think that is it very, very dangerous, because the entirety of Silicon Valley is situated within a particular socioeconomic political context. And that means that what the people in the industry think of as apolitical is in fact deeply political. It has the impact of distributing resources, distributing power according to existing socioeconomic hierarchies. And that means that the people in the industry who think they are doing things for the greater good are actually just doing things based on how the system already works, right? And so they end up making decisions that hurt low-wage workers, but that make their shareholders richer. And that seems like a natural apolitical thing to do. But of course, I mean, for the low-wage worker, that is a deeply political thing. And so I find that kind of ideology very frustrating. But yeah, I mean, the thing about this blog post is I would definitely recommend anyone who's interested in this topic to read it and, you know, read it line by line, try to critique it, try to understand what this guy's thinking and why he thinks this. Because I don't really have a problem with Marc Andreessen in particular. I think the problem I have with this blog post is that it is unfortunately reflective of this deeper sentiment that it's a structural problem, and that the people who are in positions like this guy, who, you know, are massively wealthy, who are in positions of power when it comes to controlling what startups get funded, and who are surrounded by people who, you know, validate them and applaud them and celebrate them. I think anyone in that position would be unable to think critically about the system and their own role within it. And so, you know, I'm sure Marc Andreessen means well. I'm sure he's doing the best he can, but he's a billionaire. He is married to the daughter of one of the largest real estate developer families in California. And, you know, he is in this extremely privileged position, which means that when he looks around at the world, what he thinks we need to build, what he thinks should be a priority, is not going to be the same as that of most other people. And I think for me, that gets to the core of the problem with Silicon Valley. It is a way of creating progress on the terms of certain people and not others. And the people whose voices matter are the same people whose voices have always mattered, especially in American history. It's white men from primarily upper middle class backgrounds. And, you know, even it doesn't really matter what their backgrounds are. The point is that these people right now occupy a very lofty position in the economic pyramid. And so their desires, their wills, their understandings of the world just do not reflect how the world actually looks to most other people. So that to me is the problem. The ideology of the industry is in a way the ideology you would expect. Like I don't think that people in this industry are necessarily more despicable than in others. I think what's happening is that this is like the natural positions they're in when they're surrounded by people who validate their worldview, you know, people who at least implicitly buy into this idea of capitalism and entrepreneurship and inequality. When they're in this position, of course they're going to think this way. Of course their ideology will be self-justifying and self-aggrandizing. I think it's the problem is more structural than it is personal. And so I don't think it's that useful to look at these individuals and say, you know, Mark Zuckerberg is this, Bill Gates is that. I mean, there are interesting quirks to these personalities, but at the same time, there is a deeper problem. And the fact that all these people have these quirks, I mean, I think part of it is that the industry selects for people with certain ways of seeing the world, and it also affirms and magnifies these perspectives. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say for now. I would love to just have more of a conversation and see where people want to take this direction, what direction people want to take this.
Okay. Questions? I do a question. Wendy,
sure.
What does mean reclaiming new industrial model? And what these dimensions?
Sorry, what was the last question? What is?
What their dimensions of new industrial model?
Okay, sure, yeah. I call it a new industrial model, but what I'm really saying is here's what the tech industry could become if we had the political will to change how it looked. And for me, that means a tech industry that is not governed by capital. Because right now, the way funding works is that you have venture capital firms that decide to fund companies based on what they think will give them a return. And so they're making decisions about profitability, about the ability of these companies to monopolize sectors. And it's all driven at the end of the day by this idea of capital making return on investment. So, even though you can have companies that are not profitable in the meantime, eventually they're going to have to become profitable. That's just how the system works. That's the structural incentive. And so that's kind of where my proposals begin, from the idea that we don't want an industry driven by capital. I think we can actually propose all sorts of things. The point of my sketching out a new industrial model is to say that there are a lot of different ways we can have innovation without capital, without capitalism, and that I'm not necessarily set on a particular way. I think it's useful to have an ecosystem of different things. So, for example, we could have more co-ops, like worker co-ops, co-ops with customer input, user input. We could have more nonprofits. I love open source software, so I think there should definitely be more of that. I think there could be more publicly funded alternatives. There can be things that are kind of like venture capital, but from a public perspective, and so you could have, essentially grants for people to build things. I think there should be more worker control over the products that are being built. And one useful, imaginary here is the Lucas Plan of 1976, where there's a plant owned by Lucas Aerospace where the company was going to shut down the plant, and the workers decided, well, what if instead of shutting down the plant, we just took the machinery and we use that to make things that are about social good. So renewable energy and public transit vehicles, dialysis machines, things like that. And I think that is a beautiful model that could be inspirational for the tech industry today, because we have a lot of people in the industry who are very motivated and who have the education and the aptitude to work on these things that could be very useful. It's just that right now their efforts are being captured by these corporations whose primary business model comes from, either making people click ads or paying low-wage workers less than a living wage to, deliver packages or deliver food or things like that. And I think that's a shame. So what I'm trying to get at with this idea of the new industrial model is that there is a lot of energy, there's a lot of talent that is being wasted when you have an industrial model driven by the idea of capital needing to make a return. And I also think it's one that it's not only wasteful of the talents of the people, it's also disrespectful of the low-wage workers who are not sharing in the benefits of technology's growth. And so I think there's some questions in the chat. Raphael, do you wanna ask them, or should I address them myself?
Yeah. If you can read the questions. One question for Adriana Amaral, professor from Brazil, about the relationship of gender and tech.
Yeah, that is a great question. The statistics of gender in the tech industry are really quite shocking, and it's one of those topics that has become quite controversial and polarizing within the industry because, so first of all, Facebook, Google, Apple, a lot of these companies didn't actually release their gender statistics until quite recently. I think 2014 or 2015, somewhere around that. And that was due to this one activist who helped start this movement to get them to release it. And, other people have been working on it too. But this is something that the companies did not want to share on their own because their numbers were really embarrassing. I think in engineering, a lot of these companies were somewhere between 10 and 20% female. And within like manager roles, it was overwhelmingly white. And it's pretty much what you'd expect from an industry that prides itself on being a meritocracy, because the idea of meritocracy is always woven with pre-existing systems, right? And so this industry that prides itself so much on not caring about political correctness or diversity and instead caring only about how talented someone is, well, that's going to overlook a lot of more structural inequities in terms of who has access to certain kinds of education, the culture where it's, it can be actually quite difficult for women or people of color or anyone who's from a marginalized background to succeed, because there's a certain kind of resilience that's expected that is much easier if you're from the dominant background. And I think it's something that the industry is trying to reckon with these days. A lot of these companies, they have to at least pretend to care about diversity, but at the same time, I don't think they actually care. I think it's useful for their bottom line to have this kind of weird hierarchy where you have the default attitude of being a white man, and that's just considered the best, because it means that women are always having to work harder. Women, people of color, they have to work harder. They have to prove themselves more, and I think it's very hard for these companies to change, because it's just so deeply ingrained in the wider social biases that all these people have. And yeah, like on the other hand, I think it's almost as if it would be good for these companies if women were not paid the same as men, because otherwise they would have to pay their female employees more, right? So they have this kind of economic incentive to not actually, have any sort of gender parity. And I also think this makes for bad products, right? If you have engineering teams that are mostly white men, then they are going to perpetuate the kind of biases that have resulted in them being in that room to begin with. And that's not to say that if we swapped out some of these white men and put in a more diverse array of workers, that it would necessarily fix the problem. I do think it would help somewhat, and that people from underrepresented backgrounds, hopefully, like one would hope, have a more radical critique of the structures that got them, that govern how they got to that point. And hopefully that would make the industry more diverse, more open to criticism, because I think that's something that is a main problem right now. But yeah, at the same time, this is one of those things where I think corporations are paying a lot of lip service to the idea of diversity. They all say, we would love to hire women if only they were as qualified as men. But I don't think they actually have enough of an incentive to do much about it. I think, the best they're going to do is sponsor some Girls Who Code workshops, donate some money that makes it seem like they're progressive. But when it comes to, say, women who work for them being sexually harassed by their superiors, they can't really do much about it. There's a culture that is very much about protecting, other men, just like in a lot of other industries. And what happened at Google with the walkout a couple of years ago, that was really inspirational, but it was also very unique, because the sort of thing that prompted the walkout, it was this employee at Google who was paid $90 million to go away, essentially, after he'd been accused of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. That sort of thing happens at a lot of different tech companies. It's pretty common. It's not just about tech. It happens in any field where there are a lot of men, really, and men in positions of power. But I think that's an indication of the industry is at this kind of tipping point where the problems of gender and race have been brushed under the rug for a long time, under the claims of meritocracy and the fact that, the idea that if you're good enough, you can get through regardless of your gender. Most people now know that's not true, but it's still really hard to talk about. And some of the people who organized the walkout at Google, they were fired for their role in starting the protest. And so I think, the industry still has a long way to go when it comes to questions of gender.
Okay, second question from Marcelo Nascimento about improving the conditions of work of platform workers, like moderators, mechanical turkers, food delivery workers, and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, I find their work really inspiring. Lily Arani, I believe, is doing a lot of work on that with Turkopticon. But yeah, I think that is a huge problem. And I don't really know what the answer is for that. I think what I would love to see myself is for the white collar workers at the companies like Amazon or Uber or Instacart or Deliveroo or whatever. I would love to see the white collar workers who have more leverage and more negotiating power to stand in solidarity with all these other workers. Because, whether or not they want to admit it, their own high salaries come in part from the low salaries the low wages given to all these other workers. Because if it was more equitably distributed, then they and their bosses wouldn't be paid as much. And, I think unfortunately, that is a division that has become naturalized. And it's very easy for people working at these companies to not think about that, or to not think of it as unfair in any way. They just take it for granted. It's like, oh, of course someone working in India or the Philippines or someone who's delivering food is going to make less money than me, a software engineer. But I do hope that, given the crisis that we're in now, where it's becoming very clear that there's a huge divide between the white collar workers and those who do the actual day-to-day work that keeps these platforms running, that this divide is unjust. And, in San Francisco, where I live, there are a lot of gig economy workers who don't have any protective equipment, who don't have any savings, who are still forced to, work during a time like this because they just need the money. And yet the white collar workers all get to work from home, and their lives aren't really that different, and they're still getting paid a lot of money. And I think I really hope that inspires some kind of solidarity as these white collar workers that realize that the reason they're able to work from home and have food delivered to them, or whatever, or have their salaries continue to be paid, I hope they realize that it is the work of their co-workers who they don't think of as co-workers, and that they owe it to themselves and each other to stand in solidarity with them. And I think we are seeing a few isolated incidents of this, but at the same time, I'm not really sure. My hope definitely lies in workers demanding a change. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is going to be hard. I think just organizing in such a geographically distributed way is always going to be difficult. And the fact that a lot of these workers, like the M-Turkers, for example, their work is sporadic, and the platforms have so much control. The platforms can deactivate them if they're organizing. I think it's very difficult for them, but I do hope that if they are able to organize in a way that actually strikes at the heart of these platforms' use cases, then they can win better conditions for themselves.
All right, I think I can just step in. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask my question. Thank you so much, Wendy, for your talk. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm very much looking forward to it. This is David Niemer. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Virginia in the Media Studies Department. Fascinating stuff. My question goes along those thoughts about how these Silicon Valley companies have become so big that currently they're larger than most governments around the world. And when it comes to bargaining power, they have a lot of say in how many of the policies are developed and even lobbied in these countries. And the hope, if you're coming from the global South, is that you put a lot of hope that countries and the European Union and the US will be able to tame those companies in Silicon Valley. But unfortunately, it seems like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, they're becoming even larger than the American institution, right? So do you think that we still have time to put them back in their place and get them to do the right thing? Or they've become this Frankenstein that are coming after their creators and we're doomed?
That's a great question. I try to remain optimistic. I think we've seen in the last few years that the governments, of powerful countries are starting to realize what a danger these companies pose. And so in the US, even among, the Republicans, breaking up the tech companies or fighting them or putting in regulation that will impede their functioning. And the European Union has been fairly aggressive when it comes to fining these companies or otherwise criticizing them. The GDPR Act did go some way towards restraining them, even if it didn't necessarily go far enough. And I heard that in Australia, they announced this plan to share the revenue that Google and Facebook get from advertising and split it with media companies. So I think, we are seeing a variety of regulatory responses. As for whether those go far enough, I personally don't have that much faith in the regulatory dimension to actually solve the root of this problem. I think they will go some way, but I think that has to be, in complement with other actions from workers, from communities, from just ordinary people. And yeah, because I think the government, the administrations that exist so far, like I don't think any of them have the kind of the right intentions here. I think, you know, the best we're going to get is they're going to try to restore competition to the sector, as opposed to saying, well, maybe the very structural incentives of the industry are flawed. I don't think we have any administrations, well, like the US administration is certainly not about to say that. In the European Union, I think there's some steps in that direction, but I do feel like there has to be more wide-ranging, radical changes. And I think those will only come from mass mobilization of some sort. And I don't know what that will look like. I do think that this current crisis will hopefully inspire people to look at the world differently and think, you know, the things that we took for granted before, maybe we don't always have to have them. Maybe there are other ways of organizing society rather than letting a few people become multi-billionaires while everyone else is struggling to survive. So that is kind of where my optimism comes from, that, you know, that this current moment will, like, hopefully inspire people to strive for something better. Because I think what we're seeing is the failure of many of our institutions, and the old world that a lot of us were used to, it doesn't seem like it makes sense anymore. It doesn't, the systems we had before do not correspond to the situation that we're in. And so it's a good time to start thinking about rebuilding and creating new institutions. So yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really hard to know what will happen, but if I had to be optimistic, I'd say I'm optimistic about social movements and regulators responding to that kind of energy. And yeah, so yeah, I hope it's not too late.
Okay, next question from Thais. Do you believe that the universities have failed on their critique and studies on Silicon Valley?
Great question. I guess the way I'd answer that is, unfortunately, a lot of these tech companies have pretty deep links with academics and researchers. And I think that's a huge problem, in that it makes it hard for academics or, you know, independent researchers to critique these companies, right? There's the case of I think the Open Markets Institute, where Barry Lyons, I believe his name was fired for daring to critique Google. And that's, you know, that's a huge problem. But I guess in general, I think universities are not suited to the task of critiquing this industry for the most part, because it's not their goal. Their goal is to prepare the future workforce. And in that regard, at least from my experience in talking to students and like recent graduates, they feel like, if it seems like universities are doing a pretty good job of at least giving them some of the skills they need to be good workers, while not necessarily equipping them with the more radical skills of understanding how the industry works, why it is the way it is, and why that's a problem. Because I think there's a lot of energy among young people today for radical critiques of the status quo. You know, all these young people have gone on climate strikes, or are just really, really worried about the future of the planet, and they feel like the systems we have in place just don't work. And yet at the same time, they go to university and their professor tells them, here's what you have to learn to be able to pass this test so you can get a job at Google or Facebook. And I think there's a weird disconnect there. And you know, I'm sure there's some great universities who are filling in that gap by promoting more critical discourse. But I also think it's really hard. It is hard to prepare someone to be a good worker while also preparing them to be critical of their industry, because that's not usually a recipe for success. That's the sort of thing that will get you fired or unable to get hired. But I do think that is kind of what is necessary. I think it is important for people who are now entering the tech industry to have an understanding of the ways that industry will fail them. That the industry is not a place where they can just be themselves and fight for what they believe in and will be rewarded for it. Instead, the industry is structurally set up to pursue certain aims at the expense of others. And they might find that even if they go in full of energy, full of the best intentions, that the structural incentives just aren't there for them to do what they want, and that they will have to fight for any kind of radical changes. You know, if they want their company to pursue more ethical endeavors, that's not going to happen if they just ask their manager. They're going to have to fight for that. They're going to have to build power with their colleagues. So I hope that kind of addresses your question.
Okay. Next question from Paula Alves. How do you see the self-organization of workers, of tech workers in Silicon Valley? Unions.
Yeah. And unionization they're growing, but they're not very widespread still. The recent high-profile actions at companies like Google, those have definitely sparked more of a conversation, but I think we're really far off from having a union at a company like Google, for instance. There are a few companies, mostly smaller ones, where software engineers have unionized or tried to unionize, but those are usually very specific, very localized, and some of them have had a lot of difficulty. There was one where a bunch of software engineers tried to unionize and their company fired them and said they were outsourcing their jobs to Eastern Europe. And even though the National Labor Relations Board ruled that the company was wrong to fire them, still the workers were fired, and that ruling didn't come for a very long time. And so I think it's partly that there isn't necessarily that much appetite in the industry for this kind of talk, but also it's risky. It's very dangerous. A lot of these companies are strongly anti-union. So yeah, I think I'm definitely hearing more of this kind of talk recently, but at the same time, there are a lot of material reasons why someone in the tech industry would be uninterested in conversations about unions, right? Like in this country, especially, unions are so demonized. They're seen as a relic of the past, whereas Silicon Valley is about the future. It's about progress and meritocracy and innovation. And definitely the myths that we have, that many of us have internalized about unions, are that unions are bad. Unions are about, they're about holding us back. They're about coddling the weak. And I think that is a very difficult perception to shake off. So, I mean, I'm sure there are some people in the tech industry who would love to talk about unions, but who just are afraid to. But I do think there are also many people who are not interested in that conversation, just because they have these, assumptions about what unionization means, and those assumptions just don't seem appealing to them, because they have a different narrative about the tech industry and about their role as workers. Like they don't see themselves as the same as other workers, right? Like I think this is common in a lot of more professional industries, especially in the US, where you have all this anti-union sentiment, where workers like adjunct professors or teachers or nurses, for a long time, did not see themselves as workers. And it's only through repeated cuts to their working conditions that they've kind of gained this class solidarity. So yeah, I think at the moment that we're in, as long as tech occupies this valorized, rarefied role in the economy, as long as people in the tech industry are mostly able to make a lot of money, then the ones making a lot of money in the industry, they're not going to want to talk about unions. And it's only a very small subset of them who even are and who are leading the kind of protests. But what I'm placing my hope in is that as the industry gets bigger, the kind of central contradictions of the industry and the problems with it when it comes to race and gender and building ethical products, those contradictions will be difficult to contain. And at a certain point, even the most well-paid Stanford graduate at Google is going to realize, oh, maybe there's a problem. Like, even if I'm getting paid well, maybe I should fight on behalf of my colleagues in solidarity with my colleagues, because, my colleague sitting right here next to me is a contractor and they don't have health insurance or something like that. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but also I think right now things are not that great.
Okay, two last questions. The next, I don't understand very much, but I think it's about mental health in tech industry.
Yeah, I saw that. I mean, I think it's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not something I know that much about, so I don't know if I can answer that very well. I'm sorry.
Okay. And the last question, it's about paying users for their data.
Yeah, I am familiar with those proposals. I read Jaron Lanier's book, what is it, Who Owns the Future, which details that proposal. I think there's definitely something interesting in that critique. I'm not sure I personally like the idea of paying users for their data, because I just thinking about where that money comes from and what that money is for. And so if it's a company like Facebook or Google paying users for their data that is then used to target them better with advertisements, I don't think that makes sense. I think if the goal is to make sure these companies aren't making too much in profit, there are other ways of doing that. That can involve taxation, that can involve forcing them to lower their prices, that can involve restricting the amount of advertising they can actually show. I think the idea of paying users for their data leads to some weird incentives. And it also means that the users whose data is more valuable, you know, for example, someone who's more wealthy and who's shown ads for things like, I don't know, boats or private jets or whatever, their data is worth more. And so theoretically, they should be getting paid more. And that doesn't seem like it makes sense to me. Like, I think it's an interesting proposal. I think it's provocative and it gets people asking the right questions. But I think the real important question to ask about that is, what is that proposal trying to achieve? What is the actual end goal of paying users for their data? And are there other ways to get to the same ends that don't involve, you know, this commodification, this deeper commodification of a resource like data, which I personally don't think should be treated as a commodity.
Great. Well, Wendy, well, it's finished. And thank you very much for having us today. Congrats one more time for your great book. And it's very necessary book. And for us Brazilian, it's more and more necessary. And you know, Infoproletários, our tech workers union. And next week, we will be with Marc Andreessen from the University of Oxford and Fair Work Foundation. Gente, muito obrigado por vocês terem vindo, mesmo com toda essa confusão, com todos os trolls. E semana que vem é na terça-feira, no dia 28, às 5 da tarde, por um problema de agenda, e é o professor Marc Andreessen, da Universidade de Oxford, que cedia o projeto Fair Work, que a gente está trazendo para o Brasil a partir agora do segundo semestre. Goodbye and happy birthday one more time, Wendy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. And thank you everyone for your questions. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but this was really fun. All right.